Oh my goodness, if you're even half as big of a fan of Mario Kart Double Dash as I am, and I am a huge fan, we have a treat for you. As an interview with Nintendo Dream with the development staff of Double Dash from 2003 has finally been translated into English thanks to the website Shmuplations, who've done an amazing job with this interview, translating it, as there is a ton of new information here I never knew about myself, and I know Double Dash like the back of my hand. I even recently made a whole video talking about why I think it's one of the best Mario Karts ever made. In fact, I think it is the best Mario Kart ever made, with only possibly Mario Kart World giving it a run for its money. We'll see how that ends up in the end. For now, though, let's go over some of the new details I learned, and by extension, I imagine most of you, as we cover what fascinating insights developers had to say. So right off the bat, that begins with the pressure of making a new Mario Kart and how they stumbled upon the Double Dash idea of having 2 characters per kart and being able to swap them. So first off, they begin by saying that there was a lot of pressure in making a new Mario Kart while staying true to the series without destroying what makes Mario Kart Mario Kart. And part of that is dealing with the pressure from the player base, in that they state that you have all these expectations and you've got to add something new. The 2-driver concept, therefore, was something we came to at the very end of a long process of brainstorming. We were a little worried about it, though, so at first we were developing a single driver version too, in parallel with a 2-driver development. Then someone else added, it was our emergency escape hatch. They were saying that if they weren't able to make the 2 characters per card mechanic work, they were going to fall back on a single driver version. In fact, the very first trailer for Double Dash, before it was known as Double Dash, showed off a single driver version of the game. It was a very basic like pre-rendered video, so it may not mean much at all, but it may tie into their escape hatch in which they could fall back on that. Now beyond that, though, as one of the initial ideas for how to handle the Double Dash mechanic was to use a sidecar like you'd expect with a motorcycle, and how they can have sidecars as well. But the problem they ran into there was the carts ended up being too wide, and it didn't quite work with the track design, so they ended up redesigning it so the characters would be in the back, which then had the side effect, though, of making it so you can't see the driver in front, which is where the swapping idea came about. So you can swap the characters and see both the front and rear driver. And of course, if you have a smaller character in the back, then you can more easily see the larger driver in front, and that had its own issues as well. In fact, that's where they talk about where the second bar came from, because if you look at the back of the carts, and you can see this in the official artwork too, there's 2 bars, one for the higher characters, one for the lower characters. I never once thought about this myself. It never even occurred to me that that was a compromise in order to get the shorter characters to work with the bars that the main characters hold on to. And it was perhaps partially for that reason that they were originally exploring preset combinations of characters, specifically like Mario and Luigi, or the princesses. I mean, in fact, if you look at the character select screen, they already come in pairs. So it was originally meant to be that you wouldn't be able to mix and match characters. You were stuck with that pair. And thank God they realized that'd be way more fun to mix and match, specifically saying, but we knew it would be more fun to really mix and match. And even though it caused the designers and the programmers a lot of grief, though, but it's way more fun this way, and I fully agree. It's so fun to be able to mix and match. It adds to the strategy of choosing your favorite characters. And in fact, at one point they talk about the favorite or the strongest combo that the I believe the testers discovered. They think it was a Chain Chomp, you know, when the baby characters combined with Princess Peach or Princess Daisy, who has the hearts. So that way if you fall behind, you use a Chain Chomp to catch back up, whereas Princess Peach's hearts would instantly, you know, provide shields to you, being able to absorb any items that came your way. Although to that point, the hearts were originally going to be able to pick up Chain Chomps too, as in one's coming your way. But they realized that was too strong, so we changed it, or they changed it. Furthermore, though, before they arrived on the heart idea, because apparently in the E3 versions of Mario Kart, the princesses were shown with a different item, which I didn't even know, despite having played the demo a ton myself at that very E3 and fell in love with the game instantly. But one of the powers they had been exploring for the princesses earlier were umbrellas, like the little parasol that Princess Peach at least has. And it may have been used for either defense or to float you into the air, which would have been kind of cool, maybe like a little bit like the feather item. But they did note that one thing with the umbrellas is that you would have descended slower, so it did have a slight, downside to it. Now, going back to having 2 characters per cart, one of the things that they struggled with was how to deal with the handling differences of these characters. in that, you know, in every prior Mario Kart game, those characters would have handled differently. Like if you have Bowser versus Toad in the kart, you know, each of those would be expected to have their own different skills and handling, because that's how Mario Kart had worked up to that point. And sure enough, they tried experimenting with that very idea, where if you swap characters, your handling changes too. They specifically state that at first we had this, so the difference in weight between your two characters determined how the kart handled. And we also tried a system where switching characters mid-race would switch your handling. We toyed with every permeation of these ideas, really, but when we actually tried it out, it was kind of confusing to have the kart's handling change mid-race like that, especially when the change was minor. On the other hand, though, having the karts change dramatically when swapping characters was too jarring and made it hard to play. So in the end, having the karts determine the handling for how any character worked was the decision they arrived at, and I think ultimately the right decision. And on the topic of swapping, they had apparently explored the idea of being forced to swap after every lap, so the driver becomes a gunner and the gunner becomes a driver. But apparently it really ruined the parent-child style of gameplay they were going for, where, you know, the kid can shoot while the parent drives, for instance, and they didn't want to mess with that. And I'm glad they didn't. I mean, I think it would be fun as an option, but I'm glad they ultimately left it up to the players to choose when to swap. Now, something else the developers noted is that by having 16 players per race, 8 karts times 2 characters, of course, it was pushing the GameCube's CPU to basically its full capacity. You had 16 fully 3D rendered characters for the first time in the Mario Kart game, all individually modeled with, you know, their own set of joints, and, you know, fully animated again as they're racing around the racetrack, which is pretty freaking crazy. And it was also thanks to this massive hardware leap from the N64 to the GameCube that they were able to do all kinds of things they weren't able to before. So for instance, one of the things they were able to do is, unlike on the N64 where your kart's movement is centered around one point, being the middle of the character, on the GameCube it's actually calculating what each tire is doing, giving it a much more realistic movement, which is super cool. Furthermore, they go on to mention some things they were able to do in Double Dash that they couldn't do on 64, like replays. The 64 evidently just didn't have the memory, I presume, for it, and they weren't able to do it on that hardware, whereas on GameCube they could, where after a race you can rewatch the entire race. Some other things they noted that they could do on the GameCube in Double Dash and couldn't do on the N64 due to its more limited hardware were much in the way of jumps and verticality. Partially because, less due to the hardware, but more because of how they decided to do the characters then, was they were actually pre-rendered models on 64 rather than the 3D models on GameCube, meaning they were only rendered at preset angles, which didn't include ones from any altitude adjustments, which is why we didn't see much verticality back then, again including jumps, because the other characters weren't rendered with those perspectives in mind, meaning it looked really weird had you seen other characters jumping through the air being at a substantially different altitude without having those angled accounted for. Getting back to the topic of how the game feels itself is a question that the interviewer posed about how perfectly these tracks felt designed for the handling they came up with. And apparently that's for a very good reason, because every time they would tweak a parameter involving the handling, they would go back to the tracks and adjust those to account for the new handling and vice versa. They would go back and forth like that, making sure everything felt perfectly smooth. And that might be why these are some of my favorite track designs in this series. Alright, let's move into the items a little bit here, because that is a key part of Double Dash, is just how unique and fun the item system is. And as it turns out, I went through a lot of experimentation. We already touched on the Peach changes earlier, with her hearts originally starting as a possibly an umbrella, but one of these new items included an item they wanted to get on 64 but couldn't, and finally made it happen on the GameCube with the Chain Chomp, one of my favorite items ever, and not just mine, but apparently the staff's too. They specifically stated that that was a staff's favorite special attack too. So it makes me wonder, why did they get rid of it? It's so much more fun and personable than the boring Bullet Bill, the BBB for short, and I wish they would bring the Chain Chomp back. They continued that from the moment they added it. Even before fine-tuning it, everyone loved that item. We experimented a lot with the special attacks. And one of those items they experimented with was Mario and Luigi's Fireball attack, because it actually ended up being quite different in the end from what it started as initially, being a single fireball, but they didn't think it was strong enough. So instead they tried multiple things, like making the fireballs explode instead, but none of it was quite working. So instead the idea actually came from another item they've been experimenting with, being a starburst type attack involving shells, where you'd send out 5 shells at once in various directions. The problem with that, though, is it put too many shells on the screen, especially with them bouncing around, so they ended up adapting the idea for the fireball special attack instead, which ended up working out, great in the end. Now, speaking of too many items, they apparently got to a point during development where they had so many items, it just completely destroyed the balance. So if you think Mario Kart's balance is out of whack now, just imagine how crazy it could have gotten. because apparently the players had no idea what was going on originally with how many items there were. And at one point, the Koopa Troopa Special, being the triple green shells, were originally normal items that anyone could get. But once everyone could use them, it just turned all the courses into a topsy-turvy, chaotic mess, according to the staff. Now, speaking of shells, we have two interesting details here coming up. One of which is that apparently in Mario Kart 64, the CPUs couldn't fire red shells, which I don't know if I ever even realized that, and that's kind of crazy, so I'm glad they worked it out in Double Dash where, as far as I'm aware, the CPUs can use any item available. Now, the other really interesting tidbit is kind of an origin story for the blue shell itself, at least as it appears in Double Dash and many subsequent Mario Karts, where it has wings, as it's kind of come full circle now. So apparently, that's for a good reason, because the blue shell, or the spike shell as they call it in the interview, wasn't originally going to be how it ended up as. Instead, it was actually going to be Koopa Paratroopa's special item called the winged shell. And they instead changed it to be the spike shell, or blue shell, because it felt too weak if it just hit players, and they decided to make it explode. So that's kind of crazy to me, that the flying blue shell essentially started as a special item for the Koopa Paratroopa. And speaking of Koopa Paratroopa, it's come full circle in a sense now, with the Mario movie, the lead general of Bowser's army, being Koopa Paratroopa, turns into a blue shell. So again, it has come full circle. Finally, for all you DK Jr. fans out there, we've got a fun tidbit for you, because they had originally considered putting him in the game. They had even apparently fully modeled his character and everything according to the staff, and he apparently lost out to Diddy Kong on name recognition. Now, of course, if you know Double Dash and watched my cool bets before about the game, you know that DK Jr. still appears in the game in the background, in the crowd, as a 2D cutout essentially, but not as a 3D model, even though apparently the model is still found on the disc itself for data miners, but you know, you can't actually view it in-game through any normal means. So that is sad, especially because DK Jr. has basically been dead since this point, and I would love Nintendo just to finally put a definitive answer on what the heck DK Jr. is, or what happened to him, you know? Is he the modern DK? Just tell us, Nintendo. So that's pretty much all the key points, everyone, but there is much more in the full interview if you check it out, and apparently there may be more coming to it as well, if I read that correctly, so stay tuned for more from Shmuplations and myself if there's more details to cover there, because as the world's biggest Double Dash fan, I love finding out about this classic information, and it really helps me better understand why I love this game so much, because so much thought went into every facet of it, and this interview really makes that clear. This wasn't just thrown together, they really considered every opportunity. Not that Nintendo, doesn't do this for every game to an extent, of course, but but from this interview, like, it's clear the staff really cared a lot. Anyways, fantastic interview. It's linked in the description below. Go give it a click, check it out, and show them some love, as this translation is amazing. I'm so glad they did this. We can finally appreciate what the development team went through and understand more of what the game, almost could have been instead, being like a single kart racer. Thank God they didn't fall back on that. And by the way, why haven't we seen this mechanic come back? Everyone seems to love Double Dash, or at least a lot of people, and I don't know why they haven't returned this idea, even including Mario Kart World. I love what I've seen in Mario Kart World, but I would still kill for a Double Dash feature, if not in that game, as its own bespoke entry in the future. Anyways, everyone, that's it. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you later. Let us know what you thought in the comments below, and bye!